Okay, well, welcome to this morning's panel on climate change investing. I'm going to do a very, very brief introduction so that we can spend most of the time with our panelists. Before I introduce them all individually, I just want to make a quick comment about climate change investing. And I'm going to just read a couple sentences from the Stern Review. Lord Stern wrote a report a couple years ago in the UK. He's a British economist. And his report really sort of crystallized the financial and economic need of investing in relation to climate change. What his report said is that, quote, the investment that takes place in the next 10 or 20 years will have a profound effect on the climate in the second half of the century and the next. Our actions now and over the coming decades could create risks of major disruption to economic and social activity on a scale so similar to those associated with the Great Wars and the economic depression of the first half of the 20th century. It's a very challenging sector to invest in, but one which, as Lord Stern pointed out, we have no choice but to address this. And what I'm going to ask our first panelist is Yannick Glemarec to lead us off this morning. But let me introduce all three panelists to them in order. Yannick has held increasingly responsible positions with the UNDP in country offices in Vietnam, China, and Bangladesh. He was appointed UNDP Executive Coordinator for the GEF Global Environment Facility and Director of Environment Finance in New York in 2007, where he has responsibility for the management of a $6 billion portfolio comprising about 1,000 projects in more than 140 countries. Next, we're going to be joined by Gia Schneider, who's the CEO of Natel Energy, which is commercializing a turbine technology that significantly reduces the cost of developing low-head hydro projects. Prior to Natel, Gia worked in the energy trading group at Credit Suisse, where she helped start the carbon emissions desk. Next, we have Martin Whittaker. Martin has more than 15 years' experience in clean energy, sustainable finance, and environmental markets. He's currently director of Springcreek Global Investments. And prior to that, served as director of Mission Point Capital Partners, a clean energy private equity investment firm. And our fourth panelist this morning is Greg Pope with Boston Consulting Group. And prior to joining BCG in 2009, Greg studied environmental economics on a Marshall Scholarship at Oxford and University College London. So we have a terrific lineup this morning. We have rather limited time, so I'm going to hand it very quickly over to Yannick. And Yannick, do you want to speak from there? Here's whatever's easiest for you, and get right into it. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Yannick.
Thanks, Bruce, and good morning, everybody. I had a couple of slides. Okay. As mentioned by Bruce, there is very little upside associated with climate change. On the other hand, there are a lot of potential upsides associated with addressing climate change. A lot of the climate change mitigation and adaptation activities that are required to avoid the catastrophic climate change can be actually extremely profitable. For example, a lot of the energy efficiency projects can be extremely interesting from an investment viewpoint. Renewable energy also is the most cost-competitive solution in a number of countries, in a number of situations. And so there was a fairly popular publication from McKinsey 3 years ago who did estimate that almost 90% of the greenhouse gas emission that will have to take place by 2030 could be achieved at zero cost. That means when you will combine the negative cost and the low cost, basically zero cost. And so if you have, and we were speaking about 30 gigatons of carbon dioxide a year, so you're speaking about gigantic investment flows. And so if we have so much profitable investment opportunities, one would expect to see a lot of investment right now taking place and shifting from fossil fuel-based economy to a clean energy economy. And if you look at this information coming from New Energy Finance, actually, indeed, we are seeing a dramatic growth in private investment in clean energy, from about $40 billion to $230 billion last year. And a lot of practitioners expect this to grow up to $450–500 billion by 2020, which is approximately the additional investment required to shift from a fossil fuel-based energy mix to a clean energy mix. So, in theory, we have a lot of investment opportunities, and the private sector is doing its job, which is to pick up these investment opportunities. However, this graph shows something extremely troublesome. Can somebody spot it? Only cannot make the difference between blue and green. And so what we see is actually all this money is going from G20 country to G20 country. The remaining 180 countries in the world account for only 10% of this investment. So there are these three reasons why this is extremely concerning. The first reason is a lot of this investment opportunities, profitable investment opportunities that McKinsey had identified are actually in the remaining 180 countries that cannot access climate finance. A lot of the energy efficiency investment, a lot of the competitive renewable energy investment, a lot of the investment in reduced emission from forest deforestation and forest degradation. And so if we cannot change the financial flow, the climate change financial flow, the cost of avoiding catastrophic climate change will be extremely high, because we won't be able to capitalize on this low-cost opportunity. The second reason is that if we have only 20 countries that take action, actually we won't be able to limit the increase in world temperature to 2 degrees Celsius. To limit the increase in world temperature to 2 degrees Celsius, if only 20 countries were to take action, the United States will have to cut its emission by 100% by 2050 compared to 1990, and China by 85%. Now, is there somebody here who believes that this is to happen? And the third reason is the countries in green are basically those who cannot access climate finance. They won't be able to capitalize on the opportunities, on the upsides of climate change, of reducing climate change, but on the other hand, there are those who are to be the most affected. The bulk of the impact in terms of adaptation will take place actually in developing countries, and notably in tropical areas. And here you have a situation where some countries who have contributed the least to the climate change problem are to suffer the most in terms of impact, and are not to be able to capitalize on any positive investment. So when you have such an unfair situation, what is the likelihood to reach a global deal on climate change? You know, if you have nothing to lose, you make sure that at least people will understand that you are pissed off. And it's exactly what is happening in the climate change negotiation. And so this is simply unsustainable. This is extraordinarily concerning. If we do nothing about that, we are about to give to our kids a world that we don't want to see. And so why is the United Nations Development Programme so engaged in climate change? Why am I coming here today? It's because basically the bulk of our action in climate change is to try to increase the number of countries that can capitalize on the climate change opportunities from 20 to, if possible, 200. How do we do that? One of the reasons why we are not seeing this investment is because investors basically do not put money on the table unless they have an attractive risk-reward profile. And actually, in a number of developing countries, even if you have a lot of theoretical renewable energy resources, you won't be able to attract investment if you cannot come up with an attractive risk-reward profile. So let's, for example, imagine a country that has wind resources of 7, 8, 9 meters per second. Any wind resources, any wind speed of more than 4 or 5 meters per second normally could be profitable. So let's imagine a country with wind speeds of 8, 9 meters per second. Here you're speaking about the Saudi Arabia wind power. But what is the likelihood that you will have any kind of investment if the independent power producer cannot connect to the grid because you have an historical monopoly? Or even if they connect to the grid, and even if you can produce extremely cost-competitive energy, you have fossil fuel subsidized at 90%. So even if you can basically generate power at wind power at 5-6 cents per kilowatt hour, you have to compete against fossil fuel energy, which is 1 cent per kilowatt hour. Or another thing is that you have wind resources, but you have no road to bring your wind turbine because you have no infrastructure. Or you have the road, but every time you have a problem with one of your wind turbine, you have to fly somebody from the other side of the world because you have no local supply of expertise. Or it takes you basically 5 to 10 years to get the administrative authorization of installing your wind farm because you have to have 30, 40 different agencies that have to sign it on. But in my own country, it's 27. It's France. And it takes 4 years. And so what we have discovered is that having, in theory, profitable investment is not enough. If you have a number of institutional, technical, financial, behavioral barriers, investment is not to happen. And so what the bulk of the work of my unit is basically to support countries in policy change for market transformation, market development, to create an enabling investment environment to attract private capital. And how do we do it? The first thing is that we try to identify investment opportunities in climate change that make sense not only from a climate change viewpoint, but also from a national development viewpoint. If you have to give, for example, financial incentives to investors, you are not to give it unless it makes sense from your national development viewpoint. So we try to identify win-win option. After we try to identify what kind of barriers prevent investment in this win-win option. And after we try to identify what kind of policy instruments could be used to remove these barriers. For example, in the case of wind power, a feed-in tariff is a policy which is fairly popular in the sense that it gives you a guarantee access to the grid and a guarantee purchasing price for 20 years. And so it enables you to reduce a lot of your risk. And after once a government has been able to identify an appropriate policy mix, the next thing is to try to figure out how to finance that policy mix. Public policies cost a lot of money. And there often we have to develop fairly innovative financial instruments. And so this is basically the cycle of market transformation for climate change. In conclusion, our experience shows that climate change finance, climate change investment, is a public policy-driven private finance. So this decade will not be the decade of the private sector, will not be the decade of the public sector. This decade will be the decade of public-private partnerships. Thank you very much.
So to follow up, what I'm going to do is shift a little bit from the very, very big picture down to kind of a very specific example, and close with a few things from my perspective, with more of a focus on renewable energy and resource scarcity issues, what I think are some of the things that could then foster the kind of public-private partnerships and investment that Yannick referred to. So my company, as Bruce mentioned earlier, is developing a new kind of hydropower turbine. Specifically, we're focused on what are called low-head opportunities. And our initial focus has been working with irrigation districts. And the specific story I want to give, because I think it's really interesting as a concrete example of ways in which effective public policy mechanisms can help create some of these multiple benefit outcomes that we'd like to see, is an example of an irrigation district we're working with up in Oregon. This is an irrigation district that has a number of opportunities to develop some hydropower in their system. And Oregon also has been a fairly progressive state in terms of developing incentives for districts and water users to find ways to return water back to streams and reward them for doing that to help support fish habitat. And so what we found in working with that district there is a really interesting intersection of ways in which we can then combine incentives for return of water to streams with renewable energy to then help convince the district that investments in both improving their canal infrastructure by lining the canals or piping the canals, combined with putting in some renewable energy on their canal systems, is a win-win. And what's happened is that there are a group of districts in Central Oregon now that have returned they're getting close to about 200 CFS of water returned to streams in this particular area. That has supported a very significant increase in habitat for trout and salmon. And and at the same time, they've maintained water delivery to their agricultural customers. The reason is they've lined their canals, they've put in pipes, they've been able to then avoid losing water through unlined canals into the ground. They've then been able to leave that water in streams, and they've been compensated for that. And they have also been able to then put on some renewable generation into their existing canal infrastructure. So, so that is, to me, kind of at its core, a really concrete, specific example of ways in which effective, well-defined public sector policies can help bring the private sector, as well as in this case the irrigation district is technically a public entity, together to find ways to create outcomes that we all want to achieve, which in this particular case was more water in streams that helps lower stream temperatures, which helps improve fish habitat. We've been able to put some more renewable energy on the grid, and their agricultural customers have been able to keep on producing fruits and vegetables out of the local farm. So what enabled that to happen? That required a strong definition in that particular case of water rights. It required being able to measure and monitor and quantify the impact of these particular projects in terms of actually measurably delivering water back to the stream and measurably impacting stream habitat. And it required incentives on the renewable energy side that enabled what is a fairly significant upfront capital investment in that new generation to go forward. So to take it from that very specific example, I think where as Yannick mentioned, renewable energy, zero emissions technologies, and energy efficiency technologies are critical in terms of how we address climate change. And furthermore, when you go to the very big picture, countries that are able to shift their energy generation mix away from fossil fuels to more renewable energy and energy efficiency are countries that actually lock in pretty significant competitive advantages, because they, over time, while it requires a massive upfront investment, over time they dramatically drive down the ongoing cost of a key economic input, which is energy. I think that in this particular case, some of the challenges that I think was really interesting, the graph that Yannick put up, in terms of the mix of investment in the G20 versus the non-G20 countries, is particularly troubling, but also very interesting. It has very interesting implications about how we drive public policy. Specifically, from where I sit, we have a lot of innovation occurring on the technology side. So I'm not talking as much about project investment, but more on the innovation side. So there's a lot of innovation occurring in the G20 countries in terms of technologies that will actually enable some of this transformation. But a lot of the big opportunities for deployment and markets and impact are in the non-G20, in developing countries. And some of the reasons for that are the problem that we face in terms of transitioning infrastructure in developed countries is a very different one, and actually can be quite hard because we have a lot of existing investments in existing infrastructure in developed countries like the US. Whereas in developing countries, as you're building new energy infrastructure, that's new infrastructure coming online, new investment. So it becomes a very, very different problem in terms of shifting the infrastructure mix. But yet, how do we take, as a new technology company, how do we take this new technology innovation we're developing here in this case in the US, and apply that in developed countries? Because there are a lot of challenges that Yannick referred to. And when you are a smaller company backed by private investors, the reason why you have that investment mix going into, for example, into projects here in the US, and we have a big focus on trying to drive outreach to customers in the US, is because that is lower risk for us. It's lower cost, etc. And it increases our chance of actually getting to market. I think the final point that I would like to make comes to the fact that I think it's also very important to understand that this industry, by this industry I mean energy, resource scarcity, water, etc., is a very conservative industry. And it's important to understand the mindset that when you're dealing with things that people consider basic utilities, the profile or the skew in decision making on the part of a utility or the part of anybody who's making investments in buying, for example, new technology or investing in new projects is heavily skewed to safe solutions, things that they know will keep the power on, know will keep water being delivered. And so the bar for how you drive new innovative technologies that will get us to this future we want to achieve is not just has this additional bar of overcoming what is a very conservative industry. And I think that's a really important thing to then understand, because it has an absolute impact, where I think absolute impact on outcome and success. And the key point that I think, or one key point I think that is important on which to focus is cost. And that is where public policies that do not have a strong incentive to the private sector and private investment to drive down the cost curve will have difficulty, not just in being sustainable from a finance perspective, but will also have difficulty in overcoming, again, what is a fairly conservative bias within the industry. So I'll wrap up there and go on for questions that everyone might have. Thank you.
Over to you, Wayne.
Thank you. Good morning. Can you guys hear me okay? Yep, mic's working. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you to Bruce, Adam, Irmka. Thank you very much for inviting me. I was here last year, and I think the year before, and the conference is getting better and better every year, so congratulations to you guys. I've spent most of my career in the private capital markets, so I thought I'd just give you a few thoughts about that area right now. When Gia and I and Bruce and I first met, which is what, maybe 10 years or more ago, you know, there's a huge amount of excitement around the carbon markets. So I'm getting some feedback here, I'm sorry. And a huge amount of capital about to flow into clean tech venture markets. We had a tremendous amount of enthusiasm for this sort of, quote, mitigation. Adaptation was something we didn't really have to think about because we were going to reduce CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions anyway, so we could kind of put that off a little bit. And clearly, a lot of money has gone into the climate change markets. It's not clear how much of that has been returned to investors. And so one of the big issues that private capital faces, of course, is in understanding the opportunity, is how to put capital to work and generate a return on capital. And those are the issues that have plagued a lot of investing in these markets over the last decade or more. This is probably the second or third cycle right now of investing in renewable energy, clean energy, sustainable finance, call it what you will. But there are some things that are fundamentally changing, I think, over the last several years, especially since the credit crisis. First of all, the number of participants in the private capital markets and the type of participants is changing dramatically. Wall Street really, which piled in great numbers from an investment banking and institutional capital standpoint, looking for companies, looking for ways to play this market, setting up environmental markets desks. Gia was part of that. Has essentially pulled back completely. I mean, there are, I don't know how many people still at banks that are, you know, A, having fun, and B, actually doing something meaningful. The banks themselves don't really know what business they're in until Dodd-Frank and Volcker is all sorted out. So it's understandable, but as far as the climate change, clean energy markets goes, there's really not a lot going on Wall Street. But maybe we should occupy Wall Street. Maybe that's it. That's an idea. The center of gravity has also shifted, as Yannick said, and as Gia reiterated, to emerging markets and developing countries. It used to be emerging markets. I know I'm not talking about clean energy now. Emerging markets were sort of a backwater of the capital markets where people went if they weren't in, you know, core U.S. global fixed income or, you know, large cap equities. You went to emerging markets. Now that's changing, and in fact, emerging markets and a focus of capital flows into least developed countries is a a very, it's a high growth area, it's a very interesting place to be, it's attracting a lot of very smart, bright people. And one of the reasons, one of the areas of focus is on sustainability, as we would understand it in this room. So food, ag, water, energy, basic necessities, community finance, insurance, all the things that we'll take for granted. Those are the rapidly growing areas of the global economy. And believe me, growth in this economy is not easy to find.
Going up.
Yeah, very timely. Going up, exactly. That's what's happening. So I think that's an area where I see a lot of room for optimism. Also, the type of investment in those markets is changing. If, like me, you believe that there's really no fundamental trade-off between impact and financial return. Indeed, the more impact you can have, meaning the better you are at solving fundamental challenges and problems, the better paid you'll be. I think that's why those charts that Yannick showed, that's why that green bar will grow, because the impact, the need to address those impact challenges are greatest in the emerging markets and the LDCs. So the potential for financial return and the attractiveness of those markets to investors, and not just impact-oriented investors, but any investors, is going to be very strong. There's also the nature of capital is changing. So I work in the family office, high net worth foundation world, and I can tell you that in that world, there's a tremendous amount of sort of pent-up frustration. There's a great desire to put capital to work in a meaningful way. Nobody wants to invest in the next Krispy Kreme donuts. They want to have meaningful impact. And so there's a large pool of capital, large pools of capital that have not particularly been well served by Wall Street in this area and are looking for ways to be more effective in the impact markets. So I think that that area is, and again, it's sort of an untapped source of great leadership and creativity. Another area where I think, where I'm very optimistic is really in the application of established financial tools and expertise to the impact investment markets. And we're really just starting to figure out the role of insurance, the role of small community financing. I can't tell you the number of businesses I've seen in undeveloped countries, LDCs, where the opportunity is great, but the there are gaps in management expertise, or gaps in financial expertise, or financial products that could be brought to bear, or balance sheet support, simple weather hedging products, which Yannick and I were talking about earlier. So it's in the application of established financial tools and expertise and talent from Wall Street, from the developed countries into the LDCs. I think that's another area where we'll see a lot of growth, or I sincerely hope we will. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. I don't have nearly the same level of experience as the three people that preceded me, so take even less of your time, and then we'll get into the panel. But I just actually wanted to provide a bit of a perspective from a different side of the house, which is where BCG does a lot of our work with larger clients that aren't looking to invest capital necessarily, but are looking to run mostly global, but also regional businesses. And what are their thoughts on investments in sustainability? So actually, one of the things that BCG has done over the last 3 years is teamed up with MIT Sloan and polled a group of about 4,500 executives across the world, developing, regional, global, to ask them the question, what are you doing in sustainability? How are you thinking about it? And the latest survey was just completed over the summer, and I think there's an interesting mixed message that's happening. On the one hand, the chart on the left was a question about what's your primary business challenge over the next year, or next 2 years, and they're asked to select their top 3. And there's a lot of really important things here: innovating for competitive differentiation, growing revenue, reducing costs, things that you would think would be top of the list, especially in this environment. Sustainability is way down the list, so it's not nearly in the top priorities. I mean, only 14% said it was one of their top 3 priorities, and that's down from last year. But at the same time, there's a different story happening when you ask the question about what's your organization's commitment to sustainability. And there you actually get much more encouraging results. So the top set here is increased sustainability commitments. 2009, only 25% said they were increasing. 2010 is 60%, and then this year is 68%. So you get a story of, even though it's not a top priority, it's still a priority, and people are making more investment and thinking more about sustainability. So I think that's one of the key messages that comes out of that. A second interesting result is that there's a difference depending on what industry you're in, which probably makes intuitive sense, but is being borne out, and that more resource-intensive industries are much more likely to be investing in sustainability. And I think one of the things that we found with our clients is that there is a much higher propensity and return in investing in sustainability from a process standpoint than from a product standpoint. So selling green soap or the new green jacket or whatever it may be is not nearly as profitable, people are finding, as totally rethinking what your water strategy is if you're a mining company, or looking at how are you providing power in your factories. I mean, those sorts of things have tangible returns, but are also step by step making broader effects on sustainability more generally. So I think that's an interesting bifurcation that we're starting to see. And the final thing is there seems to be 2 camps that come out of the survey. One is there's a group of companies that BCG's coined embracers. To me, they're just people that are taking sustainability seriously. They have a sustainable development plan. They have it part of their strategic business plan, and they're making cognizant investments based on that. And then there's kind of a group of everybody else, which is probably 75% of the companies still, that see sustainability more as a cost than a profit opportunity. But what they're finding is, and as you go through some of the kind of corresponding metrics in the survey, is that those that are the embracers are actually seeing much better return from their investment than those that are viewing it only as a cost. So again, there seems to be an ability, if you're willing to step further into sustainability and really make it part of your end-to-end plan, that there is a benefit to that. So from the kind of the business perspective, I think there's a mixed bag of what are these companies doing, how are they allocating money for the future. On the one hand, they are looking at it, but they're cautious, and I think that reflects some of the things that come through in the other panels. Then there's the more where the growth areas are, there's much more sustainability happening, which is probably a good thing. So in the G20, or non-G20, sorry, and in the developed regions, they're spending a lot more time on thinking about those fundamental questions of how do we build a water strategy if we're going to open a mine in Angola? What does that look like? How is that different than a mine in the US? Those sorts of things are just new questions because they've never been encountered before by a lot of the multinationals. And so I think that's where there's a large opportunity to include sustainability as part of the investment path, but also as part of the strategic path. So just a couple of findings from that side of the house.
Thank you, Greg. So we don't have too much time for questions. So I'm going to ask the panel just one question, just to get our Q&A open, and then take questions from you guys and open it up entirely. The one question I want to ask the panel, we've talked a little bit about opportunity, and if any of us are looking for opportunity, either as investors related to climate change, or investees, or in this way, this ecosystem related to climate change, very specifically, where would you look geographically, and where would you look in terms of product or company type? Be as specific as you can in terms of perhaps a specific country you look at, a specific product sector, technology sector you looked at. And Yannick, perhaps I'll just go in the same order. If you could give a quick thought or two on that question.
I mean, it's you have some panel members who are much more qualified than me to give you an idea about what kind of technologies and what kind of countries. But whenever somebody asks these kind of questions, people immediately think in terms of hardware, producing wind power, for example, solar panels, and so you are likely to get answers such as electrical vehicle, improve battery storage. Our experience shows that actually you have a lot of profit in assembling engineering. And yes, China might become the manufacturer of the world for a photovoltaic panel, but being able to assemble it in a cost-effective manner and come up with a very competitive balance of systems will be extremely important. So there are a lot of huge investment opportunities in the soft side of engineering and assembly.
From a very specific kind of where I sit, and a big decision that's facing my company is we look forward of where we go internationally, because for us international is where we have the big growth for our technology. We get pushed immediately in the context of looking at China because of both manufacturing, reducing costs on the manufacturing side, but also big opportunity in terms of growth. As we've done further analysis, I think our focus has really shifted more towards South America and really looking at Chile and Peru as specific points of entry, and then Southeast Asia. And part of the reason for that is actually comes back to the issue of, for example, intellectual property protection, ability to access a market, and find good partners with which we can get established and build an initial base. So from my perspective, those things are key as a company that's trying to enter into an international market, figuring out where you can go and find ways to protect those things that you actually create value around.
That's an interesting question. I believe we're in a resource-constrained macroeconomic cycle, and that this will last for many decades. So I like the intersection of intelligence and resources, because I think as a planet we're going to need to use less stuff. And so using less stuff or using stuff more efficiently means not just a smart grid or a smart traffic system, but a smart everything. So I'd probably move to Palo Alto. I'd figure out how to get an office in Beijing, and I would focus on financial engineering around resource usage.
My perspective is probably similar to Martin's in the sense that I feel that now there's two things that our companies are looking for. One is to save on the resources because it is constrained, and things that are going to return money right now. And if you look at all the clients that we work with, they're not thinking in a 5-year return cycle. They're thinking value in this next year or maybe 2 years. And I think that that's a similar situation. So I'd be looking at saving water usage in some of these developing markets, whether it's Africa, India, maybe in China as well. That would be where I'd be looking.
Thanks. There's a nice range of responses. You take questions from you folks. Any questions for our panelists? You can direct them specifically to one or more panelists or a more general question. Try the back.
Yeah, just in general, I work in government in Indiana, and I work in can you give us some national examples of jurisdictions, cities, counties, states that are ahead of the curve, that are setting the standard for innovation regarding buildings, offices, redesigns of their infrastructures, et cetera, that are more green conscious?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, in the state of Connecticut, they've just created a new clean energy finance and investment authority, whose mandate is, and who have set very aggressive goals with regards to energy efficiency and renewable energy project deployment. They're developing or have developed an outreach program to all the states' industrial centers and corporations that are centered in Connecticut. So that's GE, United Technologies, and so on. Of course, the insurance industry is very heavily concentrated in Hartford as well in Connecticut. So the application of homeowner insurance to incentivize energy efficiency improvements, those are all sort of in development. And if you want to find out more, I'm happy to put you in touch with the guy who's leading that effort. His name is Brian Garcia. And a full disclosure, I'm advising him. So
I think the one I would give is less relevant to buildings. It is specifically, I think, Oregon and Colorado when it comes to water and water rights and how water rights are managed, which is a very, very mixed bag in the U.S. if anyone's spending time looking at that. And I think Oregon and Colorado both have done some really great things in terms of helping to define that and put in place structures so people have a way of having reward associated with conservation.
Next question.
Maybe,
sorry, Yannick.
Yeah, on my side, I would like simply to take an example of something which is not ongoing in the state of New York, in the city of Babylon, in the field of energy efficient building. There's a municipality is basically providing a loan to individual citizen, individual household, and this loan is being reimbursed from an increase in the property assessment. And so like that's basically all the upfront costs of improving the energy efficiency of your buildings are being covered by the loan. And even if you sell the house 1 or 2 years after having taken that loan, it's the next landlord who will continue paying. And it's an extremely innovative approach. And if we can basically use it not only for energy efficiency, but also, let's say, for urban resilience, where if a municipality increase resilience, better drainage to limit the risk of flood, and the citizen reimbursed from an increased property assessment, it could open a huge market.
Yeah, my question's about just general breakdown in the large scale, either at the global level, trying to reduce carbon emissions and impacting climate change in general, either at the UN or even at the state level in the U.S., saying that that these large projects trying to reduce CO2 emissions have generally failed in the last several years. I wonder how significant you see that as being, and if that really is going to be a major impact in getting the developing countries to try to take action where the developed world really isn't, or whether you see states either in the U.S. like California, New Jersey being able to lead on their own at a more local level, or globally without a big mechanism. Do you see that breakdown as being a huge deal, or do you see the world still moving forward on more local basis?
So just to clarify, you're talking about a breakdown of policies.
Yeah, yes.
Projects.
Exactly. Like how important is the big policy? And since that hasn't occurred either in the U.S. or through the UN, if that lack of policy is really going to.
Sorry, Yannick, but that one's to you.
About 80% of our greenhouse gas emission reduction will depend on the action taken by local governments, municipalities, and states. About 80% of the cost of climate change adversarial impact will be at the subnational level in the cities. So 80% of the action should take place at the level of the municipalities and the states. And it's one of Martin was speaking about some of the bright lights that we see. And for me, it's one of the bright lights is definitely the increased interest of the private sector and institutional investors in large emerging economies. The second bright light is an increased interest and action on the part of local governments.
Thank you. Question?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the institutional profile of a firm developing technologies and innovation in the G20 and how that would look like moving to the developing world where the opportunities for growth exist. So I'm thinking, is it opening an office abroad? Is it finding a local partner? Is it finding a larger corporation to adopt and invest in the idea? Kind of like how that process will happen of innovating in the G20 and moving to other countries. How does that work?
What do you think, Gia?
It really depends on the country. So if you are, and sorry to not give you a super specific answer. So it's situationally dependent on the company that you're talking about and the country you're going into. So if you're, for example, going into someplace like, there's certain countries like China, for example, or India, where you probably are going to look at partnering in some way, shape, or form with some sort of domestic partner to tackle different aspects. In the case of India, probably more on the distribution side. In the case of China, probably more on the manufacturing side. In other countries, it may be better to go the route of establishing a local office. So I think that the skew, if you're more service-oriented as a company and innovating on the service or maybe the engineering side of things, you probably skew more towards a local office. If you are innovating on an actual hard product or a piece of technology or equipment, then it's a much more of, again, of a mixed bag. So you may be restricted in certain cases by import tariffs or by specific laws in the country in terms of ownership and how certain kinds of assets can be owned and operated in that country. And so you have to kind of get into the granular details of what the laws are in that particular country, because they may, for example, force you to be a minority owner in any sort of local in-country operation, things like that. So it becomes fairly specific. The other thing that you'll find is that certain industries are protected in certain countries. So they've set those industries out as being kind of high priority national interest level industries. And if you're innovating in that particular area, you may very well be quite restricted in terms of what you can do.
The one thing I'd add to that is I agree with Gia that it really depends on the country, more so than necessarily the company. One example that I've worked on, we were helping a water company think about where they were going to expand out of their local market. And the one thing I'd add to what Gia said was that there's also a big dependency on, are you requiring investment from the public sector in that area? Because if you're looking for a public-private partnership, you really have to consider how do you gain access to that government and how do you build those relationships. And so it ends up being much less about the technology you're bringing into play and much more about the relationships you're able to leverage. And so I think that's the other consideration, which usually means you'll need a partner or a lot of time spent on the ground and investment over years before you get a breakthrough.
That's great. I think we have time for one last quick question. Got one more? Yeah, in front.
I'd like to know what low head hydropower is.
Very specific question. I'm going to repeat it. So, what is low head hydropower?
Okay. It's very simply, we are generating energy from drops that are less than 20 feet tall, or a drop in elevation.
So it's not a new innovative technology?
No, it is. It is a new kind of turbine that is cost effective. The reason why people haven't done a lot of low head hydro is because of lack of technology.
That was a really quick question. We'll take one more. I'm sure you in the back of him. Yeah, go ahead, please.
This looks like a pretty liberal international group, so forgive me for. We are in New York. That's in the United States, so it's time for the football analogy.
For now.
The football analogy is this: there's an old play called the second man through play. In this play, what happens is the quarterback takes the ball from the center and pretends to hand it to a running back. The running back goes through the hole in the line and distracts the attention of the opposing team. Then the quarterback hands the ball to a second running back who goes through and scores the touchdown. Now, in this scenario, the second man through gets to dance around in the end zone with the football. The first man through gets smashed by all the tacklers from the other team. So it seems somewhat inequitable to those two players. My question is sustainable business kind of like that? Is it pretty, and if so, is there any way to fix that? I mean, the guy who really dreams up the new thing says, I got a great thing, let's invest in it. Everybody kind of makes a joke out of it. goes flat, and then some other guy with money bags invests in it and makes $1 trillion. Is there any, do you guys talk about that? I mean, I guess, but is there any?
I think it's a very serious question in my experience in this market. And
Well, I would say yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not just in the sustainable finance market, but in any market. So we've already seen that with, as I said, I think we're in the third cycle, if you will. Maybe there's a third running back in this play, where now we've seen some successes of companies. You know, First Solar is an obvious example. It's really doing the dance, or was. So yeah, and obviously, as you know, you're focused on the market. Things go in cycles, and so we're now in a very difficult time for lots of companies. So I don't think I appreciate the analogy. I think yeah, there's going to be a lot of people that have great ideas, great technologies, just wrong timing, or too early, or you know, policies weren't developed enough, or whatever. We've seen that, and so you know, perseverance by investors as well as you know other participants is crucial.
So I would absolutely agree. I think that it's not just unique to sustainability. There's lots of examples of people who have invented things in the past and died paupers, basically. So I think the thing that comes, the one thing that you could do, and I think that is lacking, for example, in the U.S., is a coherent, long-term, directed policy around energy and resource scarcity at the federal level, coordinated with local activities, and fundamentally, until we as a country decide that energy and clean water and you know the various resources upon which we depend to do all these wonderful things and make our lives very good, that requires directed, focused, long-term investment and towards an outcome that we agree is important. Until we come to that consensus, we will be missing one potentially very effective tool that could help a lot of companies move forward. It doesn't mean that certain companies won't move first, and you know, a guy will come up with a great idea, or a girl will come up with a great idea and you know fail in the execution. That just happens, and that happens in every industry. But consistent, long-term, directed, focused energy and resource policy would be a really useful thing across the board.
I think that's a great way to wrap up this session, Gia. Thanks for those words. Let's thank the panelists for joining us today.